Picture someone kneeling beside a small stone fireplace, somewhere in the desert of what's now northeastern Jordan, roughly 14,400 years ago. They're grinding wild grass seeds between two stones, patiently, for a very long time, turning something almost inedible into a coarse flour. Then they mix it with water, shape it into a flat disc, and lay it directly onto the hot ashes. Here's the thing nobody tells you about that moment. This person had no farm, no cultivated field, no domesticated wheat. They were a hunter-gatherer, living roughly 4,000 years before agriculture existed anywhere on Earth, and they were already making bread. So let's actually answer the question properly. How did humans invent bread, and does the story really start where you'd assume? Let that sink in for a second, because the honest answer completely flips the standard timeline most people carry around, the one where farming comes first, and bread shows up afterward as a convenient byproduct. Let's start with the discovery that upended that entire assumption. In 2018, a team of researchers led by archaeobotanist Amaya Arans-Otaegi at the University of Copenhagen published a study in the journal PNAS describing something genuinely remarkable, recovered from a site called Shubayqa 1 in Jordan's Black Desert. The site belonged to the Natufians, a hunter-gatherer culture that lived across the eastern Mediterranean roughly between 14,600 and 11,600 years ago, right at the tail end of the last ice age, in the specific window right before agriculture began. Inside two ancient stone fireplaces at Shubayqa 1, preserved by nothing more than sheer accident of fire and burial, the team recovered 24 separate charred food remains. Detailed analysis found these weren't simple burned scraps of plant material. They showed the specific, telltale internal structure, small internal voids, and a distinctly porous texture that only forms through a genuine baking process, grinding grain into flour, mixing it with water into a dough, and cooking it. In other words, these Natufian hunter-gatherers weren't simply eating raw or roasted seeds. They were making actual bread, using wild ancestors of cereals like einkorn wheat, ground together with a starchy root called club rush tuber, kneaded into dough, and baked directly in the ashes or on a heated stone. Radiocarbon dating placed these specific bread remains at roughly 14,400 years old, which meant something genuinely startling. Before this discovery, the oldest confirmed evidence of bread came from a 9,100-year-old Neolithic site in Turkey, already firmly inside the agricultural era. The Shubayqa 1 findings pushed the timeline back by more than 5,000 years, and crucially, placed it a full 4,000 years before agriculture had developed anywhere in the region at all. As Arans-Otaegi put it directly, bread-like products were being produced long before the development of farming. Here's the part of this story that should genuinely change how you think about the entire relationship between food and civilization. Making bread this way, using wild, ungathered cereals, was not an easy or casual process. Wild einkorn doesn't grow in neat, harvestable rows the way domesticated wheat eventually would. Gathering, threshing, grinding, and sieving wild grain by hand, using nothing but stone tools, is genuinely labor-intensive work, considerably more effort per calorie than simply roasting a handful of seeds or digging up a tuber and eating it directly. Which raises an obvious question. If bread was this difficult to make, why would hunter-gatherers with no domesticated crops bother making it at all? This is where the researchers proposed something that reverses the standard narrative almost entirely. Rather than farming leading to bread, as nearly everyone assumes, Arans-Otaegi and her co-author Tobias Richter, who led the excavations at Shubayqa 1, suggested the relationship may have run the other direction. If bread turned out to be a genuinely desirable, sought-after food, satisfying, transportable, and filling in a way raw grain simply wasn't, that desirability alone could have provided a real incentive for people to start deliberately planting and tending the specific wild grasses that produced the best flour, rather than simply gathering whatever happened to grow naturally each season. Under this theory, our taste for bread specifically may have been one of the genuine driving forces behind the invention of agriculture itself, rather than a convenient product agriculture happened to produce once it already existed. Richter has also pointed out the genuine nutritional logic behind this appeal. Bread delivers a dense, transportable source of carbohydrates, alongside B vitamins, iron, magnesium, and fiber, exactly the kind of concentrated, storable nutrition a mobile hunter-gatherer group moving across a harsh desert landscape would have found genuinely valuable. It's worth being honest here about what this evidence can and can't prove. The Shubayqa 1 findings demonstrate clearly that bread making existed before farming. They don't definitively prove that bread caused agriculture to begin, only that the timing and the plausible motivation line up in a genuinely compelling way. Researchers studying this question are still actively working to determine exactly how strong that causal link actually was, and it remains a real, open area of ongoing archaeological investigation rather than a settled fact. What this early Natufian bread actually was, though, is reasonably well understood. It was unleavened, a simple flatbread, dense and flat, with no rising agent at all, essentially the same basic category of bread still made today across the Middle East and South Asia, closer to a modern flatbread or cracker than to a soft, airy loaf. Getting from that dense flatbread to the lighter, risen bread most people picture today required an entirely separate discovery, one that took thousands more years to arrive, and one that came about, once again, almost entirely by accident. That discovery happened in ancient Egypt, and the most widely accepted account of how it happened is genuinely charming in its simplicity. Sometime around 3000 BCE, give or take, an Egyptian baker very likely left a batch of plain flour and water dough sitting out longer than intended, exposed to the warm air along the Nile. Wild yeast, invisible microorganisms that exist naturally almost everywhere in the air around us, settled into the mixture and began quietly fermenting it, feeding on the natural sugars in the dough and releasing carbon dioxide as a byproduct. When that dough was eventually baked, instead of producing the usual dense, flat result, it rose, creating a noticeably lighter, airier, more flavorful loaf than anything made before it. Nobody understood the underlying microbiology, obviously. There was no concept of yeast as a living organism, no understanding of fermentation as a biological process. What Egyptian bakers understood was considerably simpler and considerably more useful in practice. Save a small piece of today's risen dough, mix it into tomorrow's fresh batch, and the magic keeps working. That saved piece of living dough is what we'd now recognize as a sourdough starter, and it represents one of the very first examples of humans deliberately cultivating a microorganism for their own benefit, discovered entirely by accident, centuries before anyone had any concept that such organisms even existed. Archaeological evidence backs up just how quickly bread became genuinely central to Egyptian life once this leavening technique caught on. Tomb paintings from across ancient Egypt depict an impressive variety of bread shapes, round loaves, conical loaves, crescent shapes, suggesting a genuinely sophisticated, well-developed baking tradition rather than a single crude staple. Bread became so fundamental to the Egyptian economy specifically that workers were frequently paid in it directly, alongside beer, itself often produced from a very similar fermented grain base. From Egypt, this leavening knowledge gradually spread outward, adopted and refined by the Greeks, and later the Romans, who built dedicated public bakeries and continued developing the craft further, carrying the same essential technique, flour, water, wild yeast, and patience, forward across the ancient Mediterranean world. So put this together, and the real, complete story of bread turns out to be considerably richer and considerably stranger than most people ever learn. It didn't begin in a Neolithic farming village, with someone conveniently harvesting a field of wheat they'd already planted. It began in the hands of hunter-gatherers, grinding wild grass seeds by hand in the middle of a desert, willing to put in serious, labor-intensive effort for a food that may have been valuable enough to eventually help inspire the invention of farming itself. And the soft, risen bread most people associate with the word today didn't arrive through careful, deliberate invention either. It arrived because someone in ancient Egypt forgot about a bowl of dough for slightly too long and happened to notice that the mistake tasted considerably better than what they'd meant to make. Which brings us back to the actual question: how did humans invent bread? In two genuinely separate, accidental leaps, thousands of years apart. The first, roughly 14,400 years ago, came from hunter-gatherers willing to do exhausting, patient work for a food they clearly valued enough to bother making at all, quite possibly planting the earliest seed, in every sense, of agriculture itself. The second came from an ordinary kitchen mistake beside the Nile, one nobody could explain at the time, that quietly transformed a flat, dense staple into something closer to what still sits, warm and rising, in ovens all over the world today.